Welcome to the Be Bold podcast. I'm Beth Whitman. Hey, hello from Chettinad, India. I have been trying to post this episode for more than a week now, but my dang Wi-Fi connection has been so slow that I haven't been able to upload the files. You know, I can do these really easy things. I can get email and I can post to Facebook. So simple things are okay. But when it comes to anything that requires a lot of bandwidth, then I am out of luck. Not that you need to know how the sausage is made behind the scenes, but I was quite proud of myself that I finally got creative and split up the audio into these small segments. And then I uploaded them to my editor and asked him to piece them together for me because otherwise, I was getting messages that it would take 2 days to upload the files. 2 days. So I'm going to set the stage for you here a little bit. I'm in my room, my hotel room, but it's a big room in someone's home. It's a heritage property that they've converted into a hotel, and it is cavernous. It is so big, and there's so little furniture in here that my voice is bouncing off the walls. So I'm trying to be a little bit quiet so that you don't hear just all echo. So that's where I'm recording. Outside, I can hear somebody working on the lawn. There's chickens outside and roosters crowing as well. And of all things, my podcasting equipment smells like cumin. One of my guides here had given me this bag of cumin, and it's been sitting in my duffel bag with my podcasting equipment. And so that's all I can smell right now. So just imagine that as you listen to this. So here I am in India. I'm actually in the south at the moment. I'm in Chettinad, and I'm here with my group. We started in Chennai and we're headed down to Kochi in the state of Kerala. And as you may know, I started my trip in Gujarat, and that's a state in the western part of the country. And I was there to research a future tour. And Gujarat is known for its textiles, and it's a state that's filled with tribal groups that live in these remote, dusty villages. And like many parts of the world, each tribe, even each subset of tribe, can be identified by the differences in their clothing, mainly through women's embroidery work or the color combinations in their outfits that they wear. And in so many of these places, there are these amazing artists and craftspeople creating textiles using techniques that have been developed by their ancestors, generation after generation. Some of these villages are so remote that our car couldn't even drive down the narrow roads and alleys, and my guide and I would have to make our way on foot to find these artisans. These are men and women creating embroidery work in clothes and wall hangings. They're doing tie-dye work like you've never seen before, and intricate, detailed paintings. Just unbelievable. We even visited an artist whose very unique work was given to Obama by India's President Modi. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to post some photos of this on the show notes. So you can go to shesboldpodcast.com and find these beautiful images. And my biggest problem is that I was at the beginning of my trip when I was there, and I couldn't purchase all these amazing tapestries, which I would have loved. But I'll be back for sure because I'm going to bring a small group with me on a tour. And if you would like to experience the tribes and the textiles of India, please drop me a line at beth@wandertours.com, and I'll be sure to let you know once this is actually developed into a tour. Oh, and in the meantime, if you'd like to see photos of all this, be sure to friend me on Facebook and follow me on Instagram. And I'm WanderGal there, and I'm posting photos from the trip. Okay, speaking of travel, today's guest is all about travel. I suppose you could say that Stephanie Zito accidentally stumbled into a career that found her living in several countries for long periods of time, and she does amazing humanitarian work. And even though it wasn't something she planned, she created this amazing life of living abroad and, as she says, wandering for good. Now, she spent a good part of her life, quote unquote, in motion until relatively recently when she finally settled down in Portland to do this humanitarian work that she's been doing for years while living in other countries. So she's found a nice home for herself there. And in this conversation, we talk about her early travels and how it started with a study abroad program and then just really grew from there. She went on to live and work in Thailand. And when she thought she was finally just done with her travels and living abroad, she came home to the U.S. to settle down. But the 2004 tsunami happened in Indonesia. And she just knew she had to do something to help. And she was immediately pulled back into that humanitarian work. And ultimately, she ended up in Sudan. Now, what was supposed to be a multi-year contract there was cut short after 6 months when the car she was driving in Kenya, she was there visiting, got hijacked and she was held and assaulted. Pretty terrifying. Now, she escaped that event. She took some time to recover and then eventually went back to Africa to climb Kilimanjaro, which was an amazing feat in itself. Stephanie continues to work on humanitarian projects and supplements that work with some pretty cool writing gigs that help other people to travel, and you'll hear about that as well. Now, before I get to today's conversation, a reminder that if you'd like to support the podcast, you can become a patron on my Patreon page. There, you're going to find some bonus content that is only available to supporters. I recently shared Geraldine Brousseau's cinnamon roll recipe, and she's the woman behind Cinnabon, so you know it has to be good. And I just added a bonus question answered by photographer Allison Wright. She was on episode 68. And the only way to get access to this bonus content is by going to shesboldpodcast.com/Patreon and becoming a supporter. Please go do that. Okay, with that, please enjoy this conversation with Stephanie Zito. You've dropped a couple of things on me in the conversations that we've had that you lived in Africa for 7 years and you lived in Asia for 7 years. What the heck? Well, first, let's go back and just talk about where you grew up, what kind of influences you had, and how you got started traveling.
Okay.
Where are you from?
Well, I grew up in Pennsylvania.
Whereabouts in Pennsylvania?
I was born in Bethlehem and raised in Nazareth.
Oh, right.
Very biblical.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes, I grew up in Pennsylvania and I didn't grow up traveling. I didn't grow up traveling at all. My family would go to Florida twice a year for holidays. My grandparents lived in Florida part-time and we would drive up and down the East Coast, and, Disney World was kind of our big deal. My grandparents on my dad's side, they were, their parents had all immigrated from Italy. And so I had that heritage, and my grandparents used to go back and they would show us films and stuff, but that never even occurred to me as people traveling. They were just going back in my head because that was where their family had come from. So those grandparents did travel.
It was a practical thing.
Yeah.
It wasn't like a vacation or an adventure.
So I never really grew up traveling. And I used to say, I like to tell the story of when I was taking French in middle school. I would say, if I get to go to Paris before I die, I would be the luckiest person in the world, and that was the degree of my expectation that I would travel. I did have a teacher in elementary school in Pennsylvania who traveled in his summers, and he used to show us slideshows. Dates me, but we used to go in the little room and he would show slideshows. And I remember him showing slideshows of the pyramids and Giza and trips that he had taken to Japan. And really, when I think back about it, pretty interesting trips for someone in the late 70s, So that was kind of my exposure to travel when I was young, but it was not on my radar in any way.
What happened? What was your first trip?
Sure. My very first trip was January 26, 1993, 012693, the date of my first passport stamp. When I was in college, I did a study abroad program in London, and one of my friends encouraged me to do it, and I figured out a way to kind of get a scholarship to do it. And I thought, this is going to be a once in a lifetime experience. I might as well do it if it's possible. And
so I'm sorry, what year was this?
93.
Okay.
93. And it was my sophomore year in college. And I just went ahead and did it. That quote, it's super cheesy, but I like to tell people about it. I've never been the same since I've seen the moonshine on the other side of the world. That was my favorite quote back then, because there was something about that trip which is why I always joke about the date of my passport stamp, because there was just something that just clicked. in my head about possibility. Up until that point, like travel seemed interesting, but it never was something I thought about because it didn't seem possible and it didn't seem accessible. You know, it wasn't that I grew up in like a super poor family and we never went anywhere or anything. And it just wasn't on my radar. And another funny part of that story, which will tie in a lot of what I tell you later, was my parents got divorced when I was in elementary school. And we moved from Pennsylvania to Florida with my mom, and my dad still lived in Pennsylvania. And so my sister and I would fly up and down the East Coast. Well, this is when airline mile programs started. And I've always been a collector of things. And so my sister and I started collecting airline miles. And it was back in the day when you just had to have the boarding pass. Like, it didn't have to be your boarding pass. So we would just collect boarding passes and we would do it to get miles. So I had a whole bunch of airline miles as a teenager. From this random...
Yeah, just from keeping your own boarding passes.
Yeah, my own boarding passes, or I'd get my sister's boarding pass, or we'd find another boarding pass, or...
You would get miles from other people's boarding passes? Yep. Really?
Yeah.
Oh, that was like how unsavvy they were at that point,
back in the day.
Boy.
And I didn't even know what I was collecting points for. But later, as I started to travel more after this trip, that has become part of my story, but that's a little bit of the origin. Like, I wasn't even aware of what I was doing, and I wasn't even aware of what I wanted to do in travel. I took this opportunity, and it really kind of just shifted my thinking. And then I think just that experience of traveling.
How long were you there?
I was there for a semester in the UK, and then went to Paris.
And, there you go.
Got to go on my trip to Paris. Then my friend Lisa and I, we actually backpacked all around Europe for probably a month.
That's a huge experience for a young person to go to Europe and then to be able to do all of those countries at once and see the diversity all in one trip.
And that was, I think for me, just how eye-opening that it was. Like, it wasn't foreign. It didn't feel like difficult or foreign or anything being there. It just made me realize that it was there, and it was just in a different place.
So you weren't necessarily, to use my own phrase, you weren't necessarily feeling bold when you were there doing it. Was it part of the community of people that you were with? Like, this is because I know it's very common in Europe, especially with the gap year, but for even young people to be traveling around because those other countries are so accessible. So did you just feel like a part of that? Like, oh, this is what everybody's doing. I'm just going to go do it. Because here it would be a big deal. Like, what are you doing? Stephanie?
When I made the decision to do the semester abroad, that felt bold to me because it was very different than anything I had done. But once I was there, traveling around the UK on weekends and traveling around Europe when we had a week off or at the end of the program, that's just what everybody was doing. So that didn't actually feel any weird or unusual. What did feel bold to me that year was we went to Prague. And that was in 93 when Prague was first really open to travelers. And we didn't tell our parents where we were going. I remember my friend being like, oh yeah, I'm not going to call my parents this week because it was kind of a stretch.
It was a little risky. Yeah.
Yeah, it was risky. So I remember feeling bold when we went there, but the rest of traveling around Europe it's like once you take that step, the rest of it just feels like what we were supposed to be doing.
Mm-hmm. Well, given that you didn't grow up like in a traveling, quote unquote, traveling family, was your family supportive of what you were doing over there, or were they really nervous?
I think they were pretty supportive. They might have been nervous. I think my family probably got a little bit more nervous when I started going to crazier places. I remember my family got very nervous when I told them I was moving to Sudan. But I think in Europe, I think they were probably a little bit nervous, but I had always been pretty independent anyway. And so they were pretty supportive.
What did you study at school?
I studied journalism. So my background's in communications.
Was your intention to get out of school and then start traveling or working somewhere abroad as a journalist?
Nope. My intention in studying journalism was I was completely indecisive about what I wanted to study.
And that seemed like a good one.
And I liked writing, and I couldn't figure out what else I wanted to study. And in fact, I didn't have a major my freshman year. In my sophomore year, when I wanted to go on the program to London, they wouldn't let you go to study a study abroad program unless you had a declared major. So I picked journalism kind of as a I had to pick a major or they wouldn't let me sign up. And so I picked that. It actually wound up being a really great major for me. But I was kind of the person who never really had big career aspirations. Like I was kind of always like the anti-career person. Like all my friends were like, I want to be like a doctor. I want to be a lawyer. I want to be this. And I was always like, I want to do something different. I don't want to work for somebody. I don't necessarily want to have a career. But at the time, like this is in the early 90s, not getting a job wasn't like a normal thing. Like just traveling or just, a lot of the things that are options now weren't necessarily things that you would even think ever about doing. So I wasn't sure what I was going to do, but I knew I liked writing. And when I got out of college, I went, to back up just before I finished college, I went back to Europe a second time the next year in January with the same friend, and we traveled around again. And then my junior year that summer, I did a study abroad program in China. So
wow, big difference.
Yeah, those opportunities that I had when I was in university, I think for me, those were really shaping for me because it really helped me see the world in a really different way and exposed me to things I didn't even know existed kind of as options for things to do.
And then from there, then the options just get bigger. We start looking at other things. When you realize that this is an option, then you think, okay, well, what else is an option?
Exactly.
So go to the next thing.
Exactly.
So what was the next thing?
Well, when I finished university, I wound up getting a job in Atlanta at a PR firm. It was an interesting experience.
Why Atlanta?
So my best friend so I went to college in Alabama.
Mm-hmm. Why Alabama? Where did you go?
To Samford. It's a small school in Birmingham.
Oh, and everyone says, you went to Stanford. Yeah, you went to Stanford. Wow.
Yeah, that's why I say Samford in Birmingham. But I graduated from there and my best friend was going to law school. And she was looking at a couple places and I was like, I don't know where I'm going to go. So at this point, my family had moved to Florida and I was like, I'm not moving back to Florida. So I'll go, like, if you go to any of these 5 schools that I think are in good locations, I'll move there with you and I'll just be your roommate while you go to law school. And so I moved to Atlanta because my roommate went to Emory. I got a job in a PR firm there and it was a high tech. Well, I worked as a bartender for a little while until I got a job, but then I worked in this agency that was a high-tech ad and marketing agency. And
so digital advertising kind of thing?
Digital advertising didn't exist
yet.
Okay.
Oh, right.
So basically it was like high-tech companies, like big projection companies, like the companies that put big projectors into auditoriums and airplanes and different
high-tech.
Yeah.
Than what I'm thinking.
Data management and mainframe software. Nokia was one of our clients before they made their first phone with a screen in it. Yeah. I remember in my job, we did a wireframe to help Hitachi build one of their first websites. So that was we were the first PR firm in Atlanta that had a website.
Yeah, big deal.
Yeah. For me, that was it was a really good career experience, but guy was just I'm not made to work in a cubicle. And I knew it really quickly. And I knew that I wanted something different. And I had this really great boss there. And he was he probably was 27 or something at the time, but he seemed really old and wise. And I remember one time we were driving up to one of our client meetings and we were talking about just life. And he was asking me what I wanted to do and how I liked the job. And I was probably honest with him. And he said, if I wasn't the age I am now and had kids and am kind of stuck in this path, he was I would completely do something different. He's I always wanted to be a teacher and I didn't think it was a respectable thing to do or so. I don't remember exactly what he said. But basically, he was one of the few people who encouraged me to actually, if this wasn't something I'd love to do, to stop doing it now and to try to find something I did love to do. And I was like, what a great boss, at that age.
Yeah, sure.
And so I made a pact with my roommate because she was the same person who I traveled to London with. And we were let's look for opportunities where we could live overseas. And the summer I had spent in China, that also for me was this really eye-opening experience. And I had met some people who were working in China in this little town where I was living who were getting paid to work there. And the thing that was so surprising to me was that they were really just normal.
They weren't superheroes.
They weren't they were just doing development work stuff in China. And I didn't even know what that was. But I was these are just regular people. You don't have to be anything special or they're just normal. And I was if I could get a job somewhere internationally that they would pay me, because of course by this point I had debt from credit cards or whatever you get debt from, like in college when you're paying for yourself. And so I had debt, and I'm like, I can't not have a job that pays me. That kind of just stuck in my mind. So my roommate and I, we decided we were going to look for different opportunities in different places to see what we could do.
Where did you even start looking back then?
We just started to talk to people.
Like in the Atlanta area?
Yeah, we talked to people who we knew. Her brother actually lived in Thailand, which is another part of the story. But her brother actually lived in Thailand, and we were just connected like through our church and through our community, and to different people who were connected to people overseas, and kind of knew people through our experience in the international program we had done at Stanford. And so we had people who knew people. So we just started asking questions. And our New Year's resolution, this must have been in 1996, probably, our New Year's resolution was we were going to explore 3 different opportunities to see if we could find a job overseas that would pay us. And she was going to take a year off of law school to go move somewhere and have this experience. And so we talked to somebody about going to the Ukraine, and we talked to somebody about going to Croatia. And then neither of them felt right. Neither of the opportunities felt right. And then we couldn't find a third person to talk to. And she was like, well, let's just talk to my brother. And I was like, well, she had spent some time in Thailand already. And I was like, well, that's just like a cop out, like we're not going to move to Thailand because you've already been there. And so we couldn't find anybody. I was like, okay, well, let's just ask Bob. So we talked to him, and he was like, well, you know what? Actually, one of the universities that we partner with, the organization he worked with, he was like, they're looking for 2 English teachers. And we were huh, really?
Yeah.
And I was like, okay, well, we'll talk to him. So we talked to them, and they basically call back and they say, well, we would love for you to come. The problem is we only have 1 job. We can only afford to have 1 person. And Lisa was like, I don't think I should take a year off of law school. I was like, well, that's probably smart. And I was like, well, you know what? What happens if I go by myself? Like, the worst thing that could happen is like, I don't like it. And then
you might make her jealous, though.
Yeah, I'm like, the worst thing that can happen is I could buy a ticket and come back home. I will never forget moving. So I moved to Thailand 3 weeks later, and I will never forget like going to the airport. All my friends went with me to the airport, and that was back in the day when you could everybody could just go through security, and all my friends are like standing at the gate. And I remember walking down the jetway to the plane, and that space when you step from the jetway into the plane, I vividly remember taking that step and just thinking, if this is the biggest mistake I've ever made, I'm going to come home. And I never came home.
Were you nervous?
Nervous? Probably like, what in the world am I doing? Nervous, but not like, I don't think fear that something bad was going to happen to me.
I remember the first time that I left the country, same thing. My friends brought me to the airport, and I remember standing there shaking, with my legs shaking. And I was going on a 3-week trip to Oxford to do a classical music course for 3 weeks in the summertime. And I just remember being so nervous about doing it. And I don't think I ever thought worst case scenario. I was just like, oh my God, what am I doing? To me, it's always like little tiny technical things, like what if I can't find the teacher? What if I get lost? What if I can't read a sign? What happens if I can't find my way? But I get nervous about those little things. But it's interesting that it's so visceral that you can remember that, like stepping over the threshold onto the plane.
Yeah, it was a big moment. And as I look back in my life, I'm like, oh, of course it was a big moment, because that really was a really big shift. And I didn't really come home for 10 years.
Yeah, it changed the trajectory of your life.
Yeah. I'd planned to be there I had a 2-year contract, and then I wound up, the first year into my contract was when the economy crashed in Asia.
When was that?
97. And so I went from having a great job at a university there where I was teaching. Meanwhile, let me just let you know, I have no background of experience in teaching at this point at all. And so I go and I start teaching, and I'm teaching they're like, well, your resume says that you worked at a marketing agency, so you're going to teach our graduate marketing class. Oh, and I was like, okay, well, I can read English. And so I'm like, I'm one step ahead of the people who I'm teaching. Yeah. So I kind of got that experience in, as long as you're a few steps ahead of the people you're teaching, you can learn how to teach.
Well, isn't that the truth, though?
Yeah. And then at that same time, in 97, there was like one English bookstore in Bangkok. There was like the Asia Books in Bangkok. There was not really a lot of internet. And there was very little like teaching material. So if you were teaching in English, you basically made up your own lessons. And so I got into this position in the university where I was working that I was actually helping create curriculum. Well, I had really no experience in curriculum creation, but I'd used curriculum and
you spoke English.
I'm a writer and I spoke English. And so I started doing a lot of work in curriculum development. And when the economy crashed, I was one of the people who lost my job, the 2 foreign teachers at the school. We're at a government university. And so I stuck around Thailand and I did a lot of things that would probably be like digital nomad-y things today. Like I did voice recordings and English curriculum writing and all kinds of crazy jobs, tons of tutoring and basically lived in Thailand for another year, kind of doing kind of random jobs. And then I came back to the States to try to figure out what it was that I wanted to do next. In that time period, I wound up working for this foundation in Florida that did curriculum development. And so it's kind of a strange segue. And
curriculum development for students in the United States.
It was a foundation that did a values-based middle school curriculum. And then they worked with middle schools and integrated this curriculum together with the regular curriculum. So I kind of got that job in the midterm as I was looking for other opportunities. And so during that period of time in Thailand, when I was there for a year, I was exposed to so many things that I didn't ever even know were career opportunities. From my days in Alabama when, you were a nurse, you were like, I could have been a nurse, I could have been a lawyer, a journalist. And so I met a lot of people who were doing international development work and really didn't even know that sector existed. I met some people who were living in Bangkok while they were waiting to join this organization called Mercy Ships, which is a hospital. It was a hospital ship based in Africa. And they told me about it. And I just remember thinking like, that's really interesting. I'm going to look that up. And so I looked it up and
on the interwebs,
actually probably I probably wrote to their
in their
thing
yellow
and got
pages.
a brochure.
Yeah.
And anyway, so I somehow got information and I remember thinking like, that looks really cool. Like, I think I want to do that. And I came back to the States. I was working for like 6 months in that foundation on curriculum stuff. And I started interviewing for jobs. And I had some really amazing interviews for jobs I didn't get that really were amazing because I learned what I didn't want to do. So I had like a grant writing interview for a grant writing position that I probably would have been really good at. And I remember sitting in the interview thinking, I don't want to be sitting in Arizona writing grants for people to raise money to do work overseas. Like, I want to be overseas doing that work. And it really gave me direction for some way in what I wanted to do. And I wound up going to the hospital ship. And I went to do a 5-month kind of like training program that they had at the time.
Where was that?
The ship was based in South Africa when I joined it. So the organization still exists, but basically they do all kinds of medical work, mostly maxillofacial surgeries. On the time I was on the ship, they mostly worked in West Africa, but they were in South Africa for a season.
So you were there for 5 months?
Well, I went for 5 months and I left 5 years later.
Wow. Oh my God.
So I wound up joining.
And that was all ship work?
I was based on the ship. And I did all kinds of kind of crazy jobs. My first job there was I worked with the captain as like the administrative assistant to the captain. I learned all kinds of crazy things. And then
such as
I taught myself AutoCAD to learn how to draw like fire plants for the ship. I did all kinds of weird stuff.
So a lot of nonprofit desperation going on there. Yeah.
But from that, it was like I was willing to do any job. And I did that as a volunteer. I raised support to do that for 5 years. I had the opportunity to kind of like live and work in Africa. And for me, it was a really fascinating opportunity. And that was my first time I'd been to Africa as well. And it was a big difference from, living 2 years in Asia. But somehow I worked myself out of that job and wound up in this position in what we called the outreach department on the ship. And they did more kind of work in communities. And we had this like crazy opportunity. The ship was in Sierra Leone And it was right at the end of the conflict in Sierra Leone. There was the opportunity for us to have a grant to do work in education. And they wanted us to work with the Ministry of Education there. And I wound up working with the Ministry of Education in Sierra Leone for like 3 years doing a curriculum development project.
So living there.
Well, I was based on the ship, and
You were
we
still
were
on the
there
ship then, I
back
get
and
it.
forth for 3 years. But wound up doing a curriculum development project, which was really strange to me because of like kind of this whole trajectory that I wound up from, studying journalism to teaching media stuff in a university that got me into doing curriculum, and then got me into doing like this other curriculum in a temporary job, and that got me into writing curriculum in Sierra Leone, which was really strange. I always when I think about kind of the trajectory of my life, I always think it's more a choose your own adventure book than it is. I've never been the person who was like, I want to work in international development, and this is my step-by-step plan of how I'm going to do it.
Right. It just kind of happened. It unfolded that way.
Yeah, it unfolded. And so I did that for 3 years. And then I left the ship in 2005. And that just so happened to be the year that, 2005, 2004. My first Christmas home from Africa was the year the tsunami happened in Asia, and the Boxing Day tsunami.
Right.
And I just remember being...
So that was primarily Indonesia.
It was, Indonesia,
and
Thailand.
Southern India too?
Sri
Was it
Lanka,
the same one? Yeah.
India, yeah. I remember just sitting home at Christmas and just already being overwhelmed to be in America for Christmas after having spent so much time in Africa, and really overwhelmed and thinking what should I do? Because at that point I'd come home and I was like, maybe I should actually get some education in education, since I'm apparently working in the education sector now. And so I was thinking about it, and I was like, I want to do something. I don't want to sit at home. I want to go back. I want to do something to help. And I was like, but I can't.
To Asia specifically?
Well, kind of in that context of the tsunami and the disaster happening. And I was like, well, I can't really do education stuff in the emergency response. But I was like, but I could do communications. And I started applying for communications jobs in emergency response.
Were there a lot of them available?
Actually, yeah, there was there wasn't a ton, but there was some. And so I applied for a job to go to Indonesia, and I had an interview. And by that point in time, I had 5 years of experience working for an international development organization. I hadn't done any communications work in development, but I had the experience there, and I had the communications work experience from the agency side before. And that's kind of how it all came together, that I started doing communications work for a humanitarian organization. So I had this amazing interview to go to Indonesia, and they called me back the next day, and they were like, we already sent someone to Aceh, but would you go to Sudan? And I was like, sure. I'm like, who says that? Who just says yes? I don't know.
Yeah. Could you even pick out Sudan on a map at that point?
I was pretty good. I was pretty good at my African geography, but geography is the only category that you want me on your team for Trivial Pursuit. That's it. But anyway, so I wound up going to Sudan and doing communications there, and that was in 2000. All the 2000s kind of merged together for me. I think more in I think of my life more in geography, steps of geography, than I do in years. So that was probably in 2004 or 5, and it was kind of at the peak of the crisis in Darfur.
And you were there for 2 years, did you say?
No, I was in Sudan for about 6 months.
Oh, 6 months. Okay.
Yeah, and then that was actually a pretty crazy point in my life. It didn't happen in Sudan, but in all of the years I traveled, I never had any experience where anything bad happened to me. But on a trip that I was on, as actually part of my R&R that I got every 6 weeks in Sudan, I was in a carjacking. And it was...
Where did that happen?
It happened in Kenya. And it was a pretty awful experience. And for me, that was probably the lowest point of my entire career in my traveling abroad, because I was assaulted and basically had to leave my job. I basically lost my job because of everything that happened to me physically. And
so do you mind talking about that for a minute? Can I ask you a couple of questions? Yeah. So like a carjacking, to me, the way I hear carjacking is that you get pulled out of your car and somebody steals the car and goes away and leaves you on the side of the road. Is that what happened?
No, it is more of a situation where the car the car was stolen with us inside of it.
Who were you with?
I was with a friend who was working for another organization.
Another foreigner.
Yeah. So we were basically in an accident, and we were in this accident and basically pinned in so we couldn't get ourselves out.
An accident on purpose.
Yeah, an accident on purpose. And then they were, then the people basically got into our car and held us up and then took us somewhere and basically held us for several hours.
And what was the purpose?
To get stuff from us, to rob us, to hurt us.
Not a ransom elsewhere, but it was to harm you.
It was, to harm us. But I don't know what their long-term game plan was. Something wound up happening after several hours, and they were scared away, and we were kind of left in the middle of a slum. And so I don't know if we would have made it out alive had something different not happened.
Do you know if anyone knew that you had been taken?
No one knew. No one knew until we were able to get back to the place. But I was physically hurt and
sexually?
Yes. And was basically evacuated out of Africa and never actually got to go back to Sudan to kind of have closure of that experience there or get my stuff or whatever.
Were you flown home?
I was flown with the person who I was with. We were flown to a medical center in the UK. And so he spent like 2 weeks. The guy who I was with spent a couple of weeks there.
Oh, it was a male.
Yeah. He spent a couple of weeks there. And then I spent a lot longer because I needed
to recoup.
And I needed a lot more treatment as well as, counseling and all kinds of care.
So the organization that you were working with, are they the ones who helped get you out?
Yeah, actually the two organizations, the organization I was working with and the organization he was working with, they partnered together and got us out.
Have you been back to Africa since?
I went back to Africa 5 years to the day.
On purpose? That was
I didn't mean to go on purpose. I actually I was scared to death to go back to Africa for a while. And I actually moved to Washington, D.C. after that, which to me was a scarier place to live than Sudan, to be honest. But after that experience, for me, obviously the assault and everything that goes with that and recouping from that, it's a lifelong experience or a lifelong process. But for me, the shorter term was I lost my job, I lost my career, I lost my home was overseas. I didn't really have a life in the States anymore. And so
was there any compensation through your organization?
Yeah, they paid out my contract. They covered all my medical expenses. They helped eventually get my stuff back to me. So yeah, the organization did a good job in handling it. But I mean, as best as you can when you're in a situation where your staff are hurt in that way.
So you were in the UK recovering there. Mm-hmm. And then from there, where did you go? You didn't go back to Africa. You said that you had gone back many years later.
I went back to the US and wound up getting a job for a development organization there where I was just kind of doing a desk job. And for me, that was kind of the best option. I couldn't go back to Africa. I had to be in a place where I had medical care. I had to be in a place where I could have reliable medical care and also where I could have a job and community and therapy and all of the things that I needed to be supportive to support me. And for me at that point in my life, getting to a place where I could travel again was really my biggest focus because I was scared to death to go outside in the dark. I went from a person who was literally living in Sudan and not concerned about anything in the world to a person who was living in DC and wouldn't leave my house after dark. And it was just I was so unknown to myself. It took me a long time to get, I think that was the only year of my life since I got my first passport stamp that I didn't travel internationally. It took me a whole year to take those baby steps to get back overseas. And I wound up after 3 years in DC. I lived in DC for 3 years. So then I wound up moving to Asia. And Asia for me felt a safer place to go back to than Africa did because I loved the Asian culture and I felt comfortable there and I had loved my experience living in Thailand. And so I moved to Cambodia.
There is a different vibe there.
Yeah.
Like no doubt. And I don't want to dish on Africa at all or lump every country, on the continent. together. But definitely, when women ask me about safe places to travel, Asia always comes up just because it's like relatively it's easy.
And I will say too, like, I don't discourage people from going to Africa. Bad things can happen to you. Like I said, when I moved to DC, literally the day I moved to DC, someone got mugged on my front doorstep. That didn't really help my hypervigilance, but I felt more comfortable a lot of times in the experiences I had in Africa than I did in my own country. So I don't use my experience to tell people not to travel ever in any way, but there are, things happen. Things can happen anywhere in the world. But I moved back to Asia, and for me, that was a huge stepping stone kind of in getting my life back, because I felt like that was something that had been taken from me through that whole experience, and was doing communications there. And I'll never forget, this was early in the days of social media, and social media for nonprofits was one of my areas of expertise. And I was doing all the social media training for the organization I was working with for all of our offices in Asia. And my boss's boss was at a conference where I was teaching, and he was like, "We really need this help in Africa. Can you go to the African conferences and teach?" And I think I probably just turned white, and I was like, maybe, I don't know. And I was like, am I ready? And I'm like, it's been 5 years, and I spent a lot of time thinking about it and talking to people about it and considering if I was ready or not. And I had a good friend of mine was working in Congo at the time. And so we actually kind of planned it together. So she planned to meet me, and we actually met on the 5-year anniversary of my rape. We met in Cairo, and we went diving. So I met her for a week, and we went diving and spent the week there. And then I flew to 2 different cities, and I think in Zambia and in Uganda as well, and did those trainings. And for me, that was a really big step. I was really anxious and nervous about it, but I spent that time there. And then even more importantly than that, I guess it's probably around 2 years after that, I intentionally went back to Africa, and I climbed Kilimanjaro. And that was actually when I was leaving Cambodia on my way to move to the States, to where I am now. But I had no idea what I was doing. And, I climbed Kilimanjaro because I wanted to, and because, tax reasons. I was leaving my job at the end of the year, and I couldn't actually come to the States before the beginning of the year. And I needed somewhere to go, and one of my friends was doing it, and I was like, sure, I'll do it. So I didn't have a whole lot of
yeah, but how metaphorical is that? That you're like at the top, on the top of
it was so
on top of Africa.
That's what I was going to say, and I didn't even realize to me how emotional it was going to be. But I got to you've done Kilimanjaro, right? Mm-hmm. And you get to the
Stella.
Yeah, you get to the Stella Point, and you still have a ways to go, but you get to Stella Point, and you're like, I literally wept for the 45 minutes from Stella Point to the peak, and I didn't know, but the name of the peak is Uhuru, which means freedom in Swahili. And I just bawled. And, I was like, to be up here, to be standing on top of Africa, it was I just felt like I had, just.
You had conquered it.
Yeah. Yeah.
You had conquered yourself. You had conquered a demon. You had conquered the mountain.
And the mountain. Yeah. And the mountain.
Yeah. Yeah. You had done all that.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
And I've been back to Africa probably 3 or 4 times since then. And I will say, do
you still get a little heart palpitation when you think about it, or when you get ready to go, or is it pretty easy now?
Well, I think there's a couple different things. I think part of it is just age, and I'm way less naive about the world than I was when I started traveling. I look at some of the trips that I did in my 20s, and I'm like, I can't believe I did that.
Yeah, but the thing is, it was, I want to say, my first reaction to that is, it was a different world. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure that it was, though. I just think we have more information about it.
Yeah, that's true.
I think that's the thing. I think that's what makes it a little bit more scary. And I think that's the problem with people who, when you tell someone that you're going somewhere, doesn't matter if it's Sudan or if it's Kenya or Tanzania, or, just any other country in the world, and their first response is that it's unsafe, and then they can point to all these news articles about it. And I think the people who feel that the world is unsafe, they're the ones who are more tied into the news cycle, because that's what we're all based on right now, right? That's what everything is based on. That's what the health industry and all the pharmaceutical drugs that are, that are advertised, it's all based on fear. It's to get you afraid and paralyzed. So I don't necessarily know that it's a different world, but it feels like it is different. And I think it's just because of the lack of information that we had 20, 30 years ago. But we have more information, so it makes things easier. You can go to Thailand and you have a community of people hanging out in Chiang Mai that you can meet up with at the coffee shop.
And you have a phone. My goodness, when I lived in Thailand in 97, I would call someone from my house before I left and I'd be like, I'm on my way downtown. I should be there within 3 hours.
I know.
I'll meet you on the corner. And if I don't see you, then I don't know where I'll see you.
When I was traveling,
so unpredictable.
When I was traveling to Vietnam in 92, that was my first trip there. It was $3. It was $4 to call using, I don't even know if it was AT&T, but it was, I think through AT&T, it was $4 to make a phone call per minute from the local phone booth, and now it's free over Skype on the Wi-Fi.
Yeah. You can do it from the street or while you're on the train or something.
Exactly. It's crazy.
And I think about some of those things and I love technology now, but I'm really glad I got to travel back in those days when you had the Lonely Planet that was 2 years old and whatever restaurant you were going to go to wasn't going to exist.
May or may not be there. Yeah, it was a much more innocent, and I think I'm really grateful for the travel that I had during that time as well, because it made things much more interesting and exciting.
And I also think, going back to your question, I do have, there are certain things that I'm more aware of now. I'm much more intentional. So when we were in the carjacking, we were actually, the car that hit us was a taxi that had also been hijacked. And so I do get anxious when I'm traveling by myself and I'm in a taxi late at night. So I typically try to avoid situations where
even here
I feel like, I don't really take taxis very much here. I take Ubers and stuff. I feel like if I know the area but I'll intentionally not fly into Africa and arrive at 2 a.m. If I have that option.
Well, that's smart.
I make choices that I feel comfortable in doing.
That's really smart. And I think women do have that intuition to begin with. I think we're forced to have that bit of intuition just for the very nature that we are the targets, that we can be victimized much more easily than a male. So I think we've had to develop that, and that makes sense. I'm sorry that you had to go through that. So you were in Asia for how long? Also for 7 years?
Well, I was in Asia at this last time I was there. I was there for 4 years.
But you had been there previously?
Yeah, I'd lived in Thailand, 97 and 99.
Got it. And then you left.
And then I left, went to Africa, and I was in Africa from 99 to 2005. And then I was in D.C.
Right, the first time in Asia.
Yeah.
Right,
yep.
Okay,
and
first
then
time
I was
in
in
Thailand.
D.C. from 2006 to 9. And then when I finally went back to Asia, it was 2009. And then I left there in December of 2012. And then I climbed Kilimanjaro on Christmas. And then I came back to the States.
Mm-hmm. So you've been here since.
So I came back to the States in around January of 2013. So it's been almost 6 years, which is kind of crazy. And so that kind of brings us to where I am now. And since I came back, so the funny thing is I was living in Cambodia for 4 years. I had a really great job, was based in Phnom Penh. I was working in 16 different countries, was doing capacity building and communication. So working
throughout Asia.
All throughout Asia. Was working with local people in different organizations and helping them build their communications capacity. So helping them learn how to respond to an emergency, how to communicate when there's a typhoon or a whatever, helping them learn how to take pictures and write stories for different organizations, for different audiences and stuff. So I had an amazing job, but I was really burnt out by the end of the experience. And I had this really amazing counselor in Phnom Penh who was doing my debriefing for me. And we were talking about kind of what my next step should be. And she looked at me and she was like, Stephanie, why don't you just move somewhere you like? And I was like, what do you mean? And she was,
you mean life doesn't have to be difficult?
She was like, well, you're really established in your career. And I looked at her and I was like, I don't have a career. Because in my head, I'm still back at that place where we started. I don't want to have a normal career. And I was like,
you had a career, you just had a different career.
Yeah. I was like, it's never occurred to me that I actually actually do have a career in communications and in doing humanitarian work, because I never set out to have it as a career. It just kind of happened. And she was like, you're really established in your career. You can do this from anywhere you want. Just pick somewhere you like and move there. I like Cambodia. And she's like, but did you pick it? And I was like, no. And she's like, everywhere you've ever lived, someone's picked for you. It's always been based on like a job, or she's like, you go lots of places that you want to go. I'm not saying that you don't love what you do or that you haven't had amazing experiences to travel. But if you want to like have a break, just pick somewhere you like. And I was like, wow, that's great advice. Mm-hmm. And so I randomly somehow wound up in Oregon. I think it was all of those years of living in places where I didn't have very much freedom of movement, and I couldn't, like, I love the outdoors. I have always been like,
freedom of movement in terms of like being able to go out at night
being able to go out at night, being able to go for a run, being able to go for a hike,
being a woman. Even just going out for a run is awkward in many places.
You know, I actually trained for a marathon while I was living in Phnom Penh. That's the last time I ran a marathon. It was such a horrible experience. It was just so hot and so difficult. And
dusty.
I would literally run like 13 miles and stop in the middle of my run and cry. I'm like, it is so hot and just so hard. And
I've run in Jakarta. I was training for a marathon, and I was in Jakarta on a tour. And leading one of my tours. And I left at 3:30 in the morning to go out. And I had to turn around. It was a 17 or 18 mile run. And I had to turn around because there was so much traffic by like 5:30. It's like, I'm stopping every half block, just to get around traffic and stuff. It's tough.
Yeah.
I can see why people, like Asian people, aren't runners, like there's a reason why you don't run even in a city like New York, you've got to have Central Park.
Yeah.
You can't just run down the street, but it makes sense, like how running develops in some areas, and, it doesn't in other areas.
So I kind of picked Portland because I didn't actually know Portland was a cool place to live. I was like, oh, there's trees, there's trees and they make me happy. I think I'll move there.
It's like the coolest place.
Yeah. So I was like, oh, well, yeah. So I've been here, and for me, it was really interesting. So that year when I came here, I knew like 2 people in Portland, but I also thought like, oh, it's a good sized city. And I kind of like, I'm in a place of life where I kind of want to start over, and I don't know how long I'm going to stay here. I was like, I want to be somewhere that I don't have to make a decision if I'm staying or going every 6 months, because long-term expat humanitarian living, that's what you're doing. It's, comparable to, you're always making a decision about your life. You only have so much capacity, I think, so much capacity for decision making in your life. And if you're always making decisions about how you're living, you don't have very much energy left for life. And I was just really tired of every year having to decide like, well, am I going to stay in this job? Do I have a visa? Do I have a contract? What am I going to do? Where am I going to go? If I quit this, what am I going to do next? And just being able to be somewhere where I'm like, I could stay here for 40 years if I want to. That doesn't mean I have to. Just being able to get to that place of stopping and resting and being able to like be in a place where I can nurture other ideas versus always just staying in motion, because it's easier to stay in motion when you're in motion.
So what is it that you're doing now?
I'm doing kind of a lot of things still.
Well, yeah, but tell me how you've cobbled all that together, because I find it really fascinating.
Yeah. I feel like when I first started doing a lot of things, it wasn't as common. I always felt really confused when I came back and people were like, what do you do? And I'm like, which thing should I tell this person I do? How do I make a business card? Like, I didn't have a business card for the first 2 years I was doing consulting work, because I'm like, do I put everything on the same card? But I feel like it's a lot more common now that people might have, 3 different side things and a main thing. So,
well, our mutual friend, Chris Gillaboo, he's the side hustle guy, right? And he has I think he's got a podcast now where he's publishing daily stories of people who are doing side hustles. And that's his whole thing. And I think that's great, but that wasn't so common.
Yeah.
Trying to do, I know the term multiple streams of income has been around for a long time, but that's what it is, right?
So while I was living in Cambodia, I started a small business with some friends. We started making travel hammocks, and the business is called Color Cloud. I've been doing that for 8 years. We now make the hammocks in Ethiopia. Some women in Ethiopia make the hammocks for us. And then also when I was in Cambodia, I started doing some more writing around travel. I basically traveled my whole life, but was always too busy traveling to write about it. And now that I stopped living long-term overseas, I have more time to write about travel. So I've been doing more travel writing, ironically.
About your past travels?
Not necessarily about my past travels. So I do have a blog. It's wanderingforgood.com. And I write more about lessons learned from travel than, go here, do this type of travel things. I kind of find what's the beauty of things that you can learn through your traveling experiences versus
kind of the how-to.
Yeah, kind of the how-to that you can get in a Lonely Planet guide or
there's
14,000 other
I know,
things.
other blogs, yeah.
Because I feel like what my lessons and my experiences are, they're a unique perspective versus just kind of what I want to recommend. So I started doing that a little bit more. And I also do some work in travel hacking, particularly around credit cards for airline points. And I started to tell the story about how I started collecting points when I was when I was young. I kind of got onto the travel points and miles train really early without even knowing what it was. And kind of through that whole experience, one of my good friends, her dad was really into points, and I learned a lot from him about how useful they were. I actually went on my first international points trip in 1994.
Wow.
My second trip to Europe, we did on points. Yeah, I was always just kind of really into that. And, I mentioned before that the Choose Your Own Adventure books, those were always my favorite books when I was a kid, but there was also this other book that was my favorite book as a kid, and that was the Free Stuff for Kids books that you could get at the Scholastic Book Fair. And I kind of look back and I'm I've always mildly had an obsession with free stuff and figuring out kind of
trying to hack it.
The loopholes and all of that. And kind of the way that it's evolved into my life, as an adult, has really been trying to figure out all of the travel stuff. And I've always just kind of been really good at kind of the whole points and miles and credit card thing. And as I was preparing to come back to the States kind of for this season, I wound up having quite a few opportunities to do writing specifically around points and miles and credit cards, and have taught a few classes on Creative Live. And I wrote 2 online guides. One's called Upgrade Unlocked, which is about how to use points for luxury travel, which is really fun because I basically was a volunteer for 10 years with no money, and figured out ways to I've been to the Maldives twice in the last 5 years, I also started this practice. I'm not married. I started this practice of taking myself on a honeymoon.
Oh, yeah.
Because I'm I didn't go to, I was I'm not going to go to the Maldives. I'm going to wait and I'll go there on my honeymoon. And then I'm screw that. I'm not waiting for anybody. I want to go, 2 years ago, I went to Bora Bora for my birthday, and I was I'm going to go by myself if I can't find someone who wants to go with me.
That's a great idea.
Yeah. And so just doing these really beautiful, amazing trips. I did that. I also, while I was in Bora Bora, I started writing a book called The Honeymoon Hack, which I published last year. And it's basically, it's a book about how to leverage your wedding expenses to earn enough miles to pay for your honeymoon. Because, I realized
all the expenses you just put on your credit card. And
how do you plan where you want to go, and which credit card do you get so you can you can take that trip? Because I realized that as I was teaching about points and miles, the most common people who would call me up, they'd be I've never done anything with points before, but I want to go to Tahiti in 7 months from today on these exact dates, and so there's kind of a gap. So I wrote that, and I write weekly column for creditcards.com on kind of how to use earnings to go somewhere. I wrote a post last year that was on a good friend of mine who lives in Seattle. She basically used her credit card at the grocery store to earn enough miles to go to the Maldives. And I went to the Maldives with her. And yeah, so kind of different experiences writing about kind of these different things. I'm doing, starting this month, I'm going to do a series for, the Go Girl guides?
Yeah, of course. Kelly Lewis.
Yeah, Kelly's great. I'm going to with Kelly do a series, a travel hacking series. Because I actually think, everybody follows the points guy. Girls are much better travel hackers. We do the shopping, we control the finances, all the things that you need to be a good travel hacker. Women make better travel hackers. So I'm going to do a series coming up on Go Girl Guides. So those are some of the things I have going on. And then I still do communications for humanitarian organizations. I do that as a consultant pretty much full time as well.
Wow. So that's a lot.
Juggling a lot of different things. I try to always have the travel stuff going on. And I'm still traveling probably 40 to 50% of my time.
Mm-hmm. So the nonprofit work that you do, does that involve any travel at all?
It really depends on what the project is. I'm, pretty open to working with different organizations. I've worked with big humanitarian organizations. I've done work for the UN in different capacities. I work for some smaller organizations. I've done some deployments where I'm actually going to do a training or like doing communications in some type of like emergency response. So anything from strategy all the way down to like doing some photography or training people in how to gather information. I'm pretty open and typically kind of get those jobs through the network that I have from having done that work for a long time. And I love the mix of it. I told you this when we first met, but for a long time I was like, how do I make sense of all of this, doing all of this together? And I kind of put it under my umbrella of see the world, change the world, have fun doing it. I like to use the travel hacking stuff to encourage people to travel. And I think you can do a lot more by helping someone to travel, to establish a different worldview than you can by just telling them what you think they should think from your experience. And so I like to really encourage people who've never traveled before to figure out a way to kind of get on their
Well, travel's really critical,
trip.
Isn't it? I mean, it's so critical to your just self-education because if I do a trip, since I've been traveling, and it's been a long time, 30 years, I look at my neighbors differently. I just look at my community and my world differently in a more positive light because I have a better understanding of who they are and where they came from if I've been there. And I just think it's so important.
Yeah.
And I think if you are able to get people out there and thinking about travel first, giving them the ability to travel by doing these travel hacks, but then also just encouraging them to do it. It's really life-changing at any age.
I'll say I definitely look at people I meet in a different way and people around the world very differently. I also look at my own culture and my own stuff differently, kind of from an outside perspective, probably because I've lived overseas more of my adult life than I've lived in the States. I also I think I appreciate the people in my life also differently. We started out by talking about some of the things in this room, and I have a plant in this room, that plant right there.
Yeah.
That plant, I've actually had that plant since my first job in Atlanta.
Oh my God, you're kidding me.
It's a little pothos, and I got it when I was living in Atlanta in that very first job when I was working in the cubicle. It was my Secret Santa gift, my first year.
It's small for listeners. It's relatively small. It's a viney plant. So I imagine that it's grown and shrunk many times over the years.
Yeah. So I had that plant, and it's basically been cared for by my community, like the people in my life. I haven't spent most of my time around the people kind of in my life and in my community in the States because I've lived overseas so long. That plant lived in one of my friend's mom's houses for a while, and I went and got it back kind of after I moved back from Africa. And then I'm a terrible plant mom, so it kind of died. And then I resurrected it, and it moved to DC with me.
Oh, I love it.
And it had like 3 leaves, and I regrew it. And when I left to go to Cambodia, I left it with a friend. And when I first moved back to the States and decided to come to Portland, I was in DC. And the big plant is alive in DC, but I actually cut a leaf off of it and brought it here to Portland and rooted it. And so that plant's been living in Portland as long as I have. And it started out as 1 leaf. And, I look at that. And when I look at that plant, it reminds me kind of that community and how that community has been so critical to keep me connected and to kind of keep me planted, even though I've kind of had this life.
No pun intended.
Yeah. That's kind of been all over. That's kind of really been all over the place. And, sometimes it grows really slow. It's small. It's been there for 5 years and it's small. And that just reminds me it really does take a long time to be rooted in a place. But it's also possible to really have roots and grow even and travel at the same time. And for me, kind of, I'm in this place where I'm not traveling all the time anymore. And I'm not just here, living in a normal routine life, but I'm trying to find this balance and to still really pursue the things I love and to surround myself by people I love and, to grow in all that. So that's kind of where I am now, kind of in like this little place of pause, trying to give myself space to dream about the next things that I want to do.
Do you have any big ideas about the future?
big ideas. People always are like, what are you going to do in 5 years? And I'm always like, what I'm going to do in 5 years doesn't exist. I don't think. I don't know. I'm not sure.
That's an interesting way to put it, because especially now that things are moving so fast and changing so quickly. Like, I just think about the past 10 years, and I started my business basically in 2007, 2008. And it's a completely different world. Yeah. And so it is really difficult to make those plans so far in advance, because you don't know what's going to be here.
So my big plan for life is to kind of keep on my choose your own adventure path. It's worked for me pretty well thus far. So
do you feel like you choose that every day?
Yeah, definitely. In fact, living in Portland, like I've been here 5 years, and all my friends are like, oh, you've really been here like 2 years because you're gone like 75% of the time. But I was like, I've done things in Portland that people who've lived here their whole lives are like, I can't believe you've done that. Like, I've lived here my whole life and I've never thought of doing that. I love hiking. I've been like hiking through my 60 hikes and 60 miles of Portland book. I'm like, I'm going to hike through this book. And I think I did 48 hikes last year from it, so like I get out and I do stuff when I'm here. And, I think wherever you are, that you're not going to enjoy yourself somewhere more than where you are now if you're not enjoying your life where you are. Part of it's geography, but a large part of it is like
attitude.
Yeah, attitude and culture.
Being open-minded. Hey, I want to ask you about a couple things. One is, as soon as I came into your home here, I noticed this huge Post-it note, basically, on your wall with a bunch of writing on it and a bunch of notes around. I was like, what's this? And you said, well, come into my office and look at this. So your walls are basically plastered with big notes, like a big notepad, like a
flip chart.
Yeah, big flip chart. Yeah, with big notes on it. And that's how you track your tasks.
Yeah.
Is that right?
It's the most impractical way for a person who travels a lot to keep their to-do list. But I love kind of, if I could like paint my entire house with whiteboard paint, I probably would. But I love being able to brainstorm and write things down. And I don't know, there's something about me, if I can write it down big, like
it's in your face.
Yeah, it's in your face and it helps me. And so I track a lot of different things on Post-it notes, and I almost like feel I really like facilitation, like conference facilitation. And that's something else I kind of do, kind of to facilitate that whole experience of like, oh, these are the things I have to do. And I like to be able to see it big and kind of as I almost kind of mind map my to-do list, so I can see kind of how the different things I'm doing connect.
Are those all different projects that you're working on for one organization, or are they different organizations, different projects?
Right now I'm working on different projects for different organizations, but it's also kind of the beginning of the year, so I've been brainstorming. I have Post-it notes right now for kind of brainstorming topics for the different columns, the different things I'm going to write and pitch for this year. So I have one of those for each of the outlets I work on, and I have a couple for some of the communications projects I'm doing. And I also have a few hanging up that are kind of like my positive and negatives from 2018, and kind of thinking through kind of dreams and kind of my probabilities for this year or possibilities for next year. So.
Well, that brings me to another question. So January 10th, which I love. We discussed this earlier before recording. Tell me about January 10th for you.
It actually is the day, January 10th today.
So today, that's the day that we're recording, and but this will go live in probably a few weeks. Yeah. But January 10th, so that has a significant.
Yeah. So January 10th is it's kind of a funny day for me. I don't even know how I arbitrarily got to this date, but I realized a long time ago, I've always been a big setter of goals and kind of planning. And I do fun goals every year on my birthday. I do the number of goals for however years old I am. So I have like 40, I'm 45 now. I have 45 fun goals for this year. And those are usually like, I want to travel here. I want to like learn how to cook. You know, the older you get, the more random things you have to make up. I'm like, I want to do, like last year, I wanted to do a private tango lesson, and I wanted to, get a massage every month, and kind of more in the random fun categories. And then in January, I kind of do more of a traditional like review of the year before. Think of more like serious goals. What are my work goals, my financial goals, my community, relationship, spiritual, giving, service, kind of all of those more like those kind of, I do a kind of a travel wrap up too, but still. Anyway, I've really recognized over time that doing it at the end of the year isn't really the best time for me. Holidays are great. I don't necessarily love the holidays because I don't always have like, I don't necessarily have like a natural family to do things with at the holidays. And I'm always just kind of weird those months. And I also eat really weird stuff, which affects my brain. So
like what?
I mean, like stuff I wouldn't eat the rest of the year, you know?
Oh, you
like
mean,
that you eat at
Christmas. I see. So during that time period, yeah.
You know, like you eat cookies during Christmas and you wouldn't eat them for the rest of the year. And like your brain is just mush. And then that's when you're setting your goals for the whole year ahead.
It's a really good point.
Yeah. And so I feel like January 10th it's still the new year. You're still fresh into the new year. But anything that you're making kind of as like an unrealistic resolution, most people have like kind of quit them by January 10th, you know? And so I feel like January 10th is a good time to like sit down and say like, where do I want to head this year? And so I use up all the days in 2018 for 2018. And then January 1st to 10th is when I kind of just start processing all of the stuff from the year behind and the year ahead. And then January 10th is kind of my day that I'm like, okay, today's kind of my own new year. Today's the day I'm going to like set my intention for the year ahead.
I think that's great. And I think it's really important for me to hear, and I think for people to hear, that it's okay to make your own rules.
Yeah, definitely.
Like, because everybody else is making, December 31st, January 1st. That's when you have to make your New Year's resolutions. And that's just not the case. You could do it whenever you want. Every day is an opportunity. Why not take it?
Exactly.
Make it
or any
day
day that's significant to you, I feel like whatever works. I am a kind of a rule setter. I'm a rule breaker. I also really like rules, but I like rules that I make up.
I like that plan a lot. And I also, what really resonated with me was like what I have noticed over the years, and it took me a long time to kind of clue into this, is that January generally isn't a great month for me. And for a long time, I didn't know why. And I think it's the hangover.
Yeah.
I think it's the food hangover from December and not eating well. And so I made a really concerted effort this year to eat well throughout the month. And John and I, we joined our local gym in November. And so I was working out more than usual, more than I had been previously, and doing my running. And I think all that really helped to make it a smoother transition into January. And I planned a bunch of stuff for the month of January, like coming down to Portland, and I'm going to a house concert this weekend, a flamenco house concert.
Ooh,
Yeah, just doing all these cool things. And it's like, that's what I need to do, is I need to get out of the freaking house because it's, winter in the Pacific Northwest.
Exactly.
And unless I'm going to Hawaii, then, that's the next best thing, is just to take care of myself and get out, get out and do something. Your mom, I think I saw this on your Facebook page. Your mom just recently started an animal sanctuary. Is that right?
Yep.
What's that all about, for one? And then is there like a philanthropic thread in your family, or it just so happens that she loves animals and she wanted to start
I think
this?
she really just loves animals. When I was growing up, my friends used to call our house the Zito Zoo. And I thought, it's supposed to be because we like to have pets. I think it wasn't until years later I was like, oh, my mom likes pets.
Oh, yeah. I thought you were going to say your mom was crazy.
No, no.
So it's like at the zoo.
My mom likes pets. No, because we had a lot of animals. Yeah, probably the fact that my mom kind of lives on a farm and has animals, that's not new. But I think it's probably been 10 years. She started out where she got this. I don't know where she got the horse originally, but my mom wound up getting a horse kind of as a rescue, and was living on this farm property, and it was kind of just a horse. And then there was another horse, and then there was, a pig and a dog and another dog. And basically, if anyone has an animal that needs a sanctuary, it's been abused, abandoned, neglected, my mother will take in this animal. She's always worked in kind of child development and speech therapy, and retired, I guess, probably 2 or 3 years ago. So it's been doing kind of the farm full time. But I think it had this vision that the farm could be kind of some kind of therapy, a place for therapy, as well as a sanctuary for the animals. And
where is this?
It's in Florida, in Fort Myers. And anyway, so just this past year, she was like, I want to keep doing this, and I would love it to be able to be something that's eventually open to the community, that people can come and experience and whatever. She's like, I'm retired. I need to figure out a way to fund it, to pay for it. And she was like, do you think I could set it up as a nonprofit? And I was like, yeah, you could certainly set it up as a nonprofit.
Good for her.
Yeah.
How old is she?
She's 73, I think.
Good for her. Oh my gosh. Just goes to show you. Doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Age does not matter. Just the importance of staying active, finding new challenges, making new challenges for yourself.
Yeah. And I'm pretty proud of my mom. Like, I've helped her figure out a lot of things. I do communications for nonprofits for a living, so I've been able to help her do a couple of things, but she's been really eager to learn new things, to like figure out how to like set up donations, Facebook donations, and all kinds of different things so I really appreciate that about her. And I was also telling you that my grandmother just got her passport. She's got her passport renewed. She's 93, and she said, my passport expires when I'm 103.
I love it.
So my favorite story about my grandmother is that about 2 years ago, she got a Frontier Airlines credit card, and she's like, I'm earning Frontier Airlines miles now, so I can come visit you out there in Oregon. And I'm like, God. Graham, you really don't want to fly Frontier out here.
Yeah, right.
It's a long trip, and you're 93. But
I know.
She's like, I'm paying for everything with my credit card. Isn't that exciting?
So good genes.
Yeah,
I got some good.
I got some good genes, and I actually did. I'd mentioned my dad's family came from Italy. A couple years ago, I actually went to one of the towns where my grandparents came from, and I had never looked at my family as the family that traveled, or like I had inherited kind of this wanderlust from anyone. But I actually traveled from Portland to Rome, got off of the plane in Rome, and like got on a train and took a train to this place, and then got on a bus and took the bus from the train to this tiny village. And I was standing on the top of this hill in this little town, and I was like looking out, and I was like, having just done the whole trip from the US to this random village, I stood on that hill and I was like, how in the world did people get from here? Like, how did they do this trip in reverse in like the early 1900s? Like, how did they have information that they wanted to get from here to the States?
Sounds like a book in the making.
It just kind of blew my mind. And I was like, okay, well, whoever those relatives were who had like that vision to get somewhere they couldn't see because they knew they wanted to be somewhere different, that's where my wanderlust DNA came from.
Yeah. As we wrap up, is there anything that you want to cover that we haven't chatted about?
I have covered like my entire life story here. I don't know.
I really appreciate that. I think the thing that's most fascinating for me is, I guess I don't talk to a lot of people who have spent long periods of time in one place, meaning in a foreign country. And now I know the digital nomad thing is all the rage, and people they're taking their own businesses with them, which is quite different than going someplace and working, especially working to be of service to others. Hopefully there's plenty of that still going on.
Yeah.
I would imagine so, like the humanitarian aid and Peace Corps, like, a lot of volunteer work as well. But that's what impresses me most. And now you've come back and you've been able to have a home base, but then pull together your talents and kind of identify your talents and make them all work. Hopefully you're happy.
Yeah, I am. And I think, when you asked about kind of starting with where I'm at now, I was like, where am I at now? And the thing I was thinking was, I'm doing a lot of things, but at the same time, I kind of feel like I'm at this place of pause, and I'm kind of happy to be in that place for a little bit, but not out of like apathy, but kind of out of like a nurturing season. And I think a lot of times when I listen to podcasts or talk to people, you always have these stories of people who are doing all of these things, but not very many people talk from that place of pause. It's more of like the place of performance, because that's what you want to talk about, those exciting things. But I guess if I had to say something, like, this has been a really good place, like kind of this place of stopping and this place of trying to find a home base. And I would just want to encourage people who were kind of in that place of the trying to figure it out, that's a great place to be. I remember one of the first years I was here, I remember being at the World Domination Summit, the conference that Chris does. And I was talking to a friend who, this was right after I had quit my job. And I kept telling people like, oh yeah, I quit my job. And they're like, oh, congratulations, you quit your job. I'm so excited for you. You quit your job. Where are you going? And I'm like, oh, well, my job was in Cambodia. And it was actually probably the best job I've ever had, but I was really burnt out. And so I'm not sure what I'm going to do now. And it was kind of like quitting your job had this like great banner because it was the new cool thing to do. And not quitting your job because I wasn't quitting my job because it was the cool thing to do. I was quitting my job because it was the right thing for me at the time. And I remember talking to another girl and she was like, I kind of feel bad because what I really want right now is to buy a house and get a dog. And I feel like that's not the cool thing to tell people here because everybody like wants to quit their job and travel, but that's not where I'm at. I was like, but you know what? The whole premise of this gathering isn't about quitting your job and traveling or becoming an entrepreneur because it's the cool thing to do or getting a side hustle because it's the cool thing to do. It's about recognizing who you are and being authentic to yourself and figuring out what it is that you want and going after that right now. If it's the cool thing to do or if it's not the cool thing to do. I'm kind of doing the not cool thing right now. I guess, well, maybe I am because Portland's cool, but I'm kind of doing like the not cool thing for me. And okay, I'm going to be here and wait in this space to figure out or to be still enough that I can hear that inkling of what it is that I want to step into wholeheartedly next.
I was just talking about this in my end of year wrap up episode on the podcast. I talked about a few things and this very thing about, I'll back up a little bit. Somebody had reached out to me and said, I have a Facebook group called Be Bold. I think you're part of that. She said, I want to write something about unbolding. And I was like, what's unbolding? I've never heard of that. And she said, I just don't feel bold.
Italics.
And I want to, yeah, exactly. She said, I just want to sit in being unbold about, just not being bold. And I thought that was really interesting. And then, I felt a little bad because I felt like I'm putting pressure on her and other people to be bold, right? And and certainly I want people to take steps and do things that are out of their comfort zone because I think that is critical to life. Don't just sit on the couch, and watch TV. It's too easy. But if you can do things intentionally, and you use the word pause, if you can take that pause and be intentional about it, it brings a whole different level of meaning to it, as long as you're not doing it for lazy reasons. And we're all prone to being lazy. I'm not immune to that. I think it is really important to take that space. Beginning of the year is always a really good time for that.
January 10th.
January 10th. It's always a really good time because things tend to be a little bit slower, especially, we're past the holidays now, but especially I always feel like between Christmas and New Year's and shortly after that, it's always a nice time. But I think we need to learn how to give ourselves more white space in our own heads and put the digital devices down and read and pick up a book and stare out the window and appreciate the views and go for a hike and do these things that really get us connected because we are so out of touch and we're so stressed out that it's just, it's sad when you think that taking a pause is a bad thing. Yeah. Because culturally it has become that.
And it's harder for me to pause than it is for me to buy a plane ticket.
Yeah.
Like I was feeling a little bit anxious this week. I think I told you, I really want to go to Costa Rica because it's not sunny here. I don't need to go to Costa Rica this week. I need to spend the time and think about my goals for the year and actually do that in a good headspace. And so
complete opposite to what I just said 2 minutes ago. So don't pay attention to that because I always end the episodes with this question. What does it mean to you to be bold?
I think it's stepping into the places where you're uncomfortable and chasing the things that you want, especially if they're things that are hard to get or things that aren't the things that other people think that you should have.
I think sometimes people don't even know what they want.
Oh, definitely.
What's your recommendation in figuring that part of it out?
I think talking to people who know you really well. I was actually talking to a friend the other day who I've known for a really long time, who's kind of going through this. She has 2-year-old twins and is kind of going through this, figuring out kind of how to manage her life and stuff. And I was talking to her and it was very clear to me what she was saying, the choice she wanted to make. And I was like, it's really clear to me what you're saying. And she was like, I just don't think I've talked to anyone who knows me really well for a while about this. And just talking it out to not in your own head, but to someone who knows you well, a lot of times it's really evident what you need. And if you're talking to someone that you're completely comfortable with and who knows you well enough to be like, of course, that's what you want.
Well, it's like the counselor
yeah,
friend
exactly.
who told you in Cambodia, like, what are you doing?
Like
This
the
is what
most
you need to do.
obvious thing ever. So I think, talking to those people and making space to do to think through those different things, and actually the space to think. Yes, today is my kind of goal setting day, but I've been fostering those thoughts kind of for the last 2 weeks in my head about like, what are those things? What are the things that you want to be possible, and what do you need to get to them? And so, I've been thinking about that, and it kind of it's kind of been evolving. I think that's how you get to those places to learn what it is that you might want to go after next. And if you don't know, then you just pick something, and it's like stepping over that threshold onto the airplane. There's not a whole lot of choices that we make these days that we can't turn around if we realize we've just done the stupidest thing ever.
I had this gal on the podcast late last year, Cassandra Overby, and she wrote a book, Explore Europe on Foot. She talked about this big trip that she had taken to big fanfare. She had saved up all this money and she was going to go travel for a year, and she went to Guatemala and she was there for a few months. I think she was doing some volunteer work and that sort of thing. And then she's like, I'm not happy and I don't want to travel. I'm going to go home. And she described it as being really embarrassed. It was a big, big deal for her, kind of tail between the legs, coming back. And it was so hard for her. That doesn't resonate with me. Hopefully, because you're giving people that kind of permission, that encouragement, that if it's not right, it's not a big deal. You turn around and you come back. And I think that's exactly it. And
well, it might not be easy to turn around and come back, but if we were like more gracious to people who like did something bold, who realized it wasn't the right thing, and it wasn't so shaming to like try something and fail at it, would you try more things? I always kind of grew up around my mother with her animals, like no one ever told me like, don't do this or don't try this or don't, it was okay to try and fail and then try something new. Or
do you spend much time on social media?
I'm mostly on Instagram. I'm on all of the social media at Wandering Zito, but I'm not a huge consumer of social media.
So you post, but
I post and I, scroll through things, but
well, when you talk about shaming, if it wasn't such a big thing, that reminds me of social media, that maybe we're shaming people too much into things. But I almost think I think it's a little bit more subtle than that. I think it's not an outward shaming. And again, like I am guilty of this myself. I post the positive things, right? So it makes it look like, look at Beth's life. Oh my God, best life ever. And like I do have kind of a cool life. So like, there is that. There is that. But I don't post when I feel crappy, because I don't want to complain to people.
Yeah.
But I think I think even that is a bit of shaming. Just like this gal who reached out to me and said, I'm not feeling bold. I actually want to post about being unbold. Maybe she felt shame about doing that because she was going against the grain. Anyway, so that's my whole thing about that social media, is that we have this high standard of perfection, and it's all the the beautiful women with their lips puckered out, taking photos of themselves in front of the Taj Mahal or wherever.
Yeah. Well, I hope that in the kind of the pendulum swing of social media, more people have recognized that social media is a very curated, and even social media that starts out as a not curated, like Instagram. I used to love Instagram because it was like the one that felt really organic and authentic, and you would just take pictures of anything. And now like you can't post something on your Instagram account unless it's like curated and beautiful, and you consider what the 2 pictures before and the 2 pictures after and how it all looks in your
in one feed.
Yeah. And so I don't know. I love social media. It's been amazing to kind of keep up with my world and keep my plan alive. But it is, at the same time, I recognize that living my life is more important than showing my life.
I want to end it right there because I love that.
Okay.
Living your life is more important than showing your life. And 5 years ago, we were mocking people who weren't on Facebook. My sister-in-law, for one, just like, I can't believe you're not on Facebook. Now I'm like, oh my God, she's the smartest one in the family. So let's leave it at that. Thank you so much for having me in your gorgeous home with all of your beautiful textiles and trinkets and furniture and all the amazing things here that just bring me back to Asia. And yeah, I look forward to staying connected with you on and off social media.
Awesome.
Thanks, Stephanie.
Thank you.
I've never spent any significant amount of time living in another country, and I can only imagine how difficult that must be. So I really have to hand it to Stephanie. It seems like she's lived several lifetimes already with all of that travel. For links to all the things we chatted about in this episode, go to shesboldpodcast.com, and there you will find the show notes for this and all episodes. You can also find those links and show notes in whatever podcast app it is that you use to listen. While you're there, don't forget to check out my Patreon page. It's basically a way for you to say, yes, I like what I'm hearing on the She's Bold podcast, and I'm willing to support the show and get some special benefits. You'll have some access to some really great bonus content and be part of a Facebook group too. You can find out more by going to shesboldpodcast.com/Patreon. You can connect with me by friending me on Facebook, and I'm Wonder Gal on Instagram. Ladies, you can join the Be Bold Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/Be Bold group. You're going to love the positivity, the encouragement, and the support from that community. Thanks for joining me for another episode of the She's Bold podcast. Until next time, be bold.